Josh is going to pray for us. Bow your heads, please.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day. I pray you would just please bless it, and that we would learn a lot, and that we would absorb all the material. And thank you. In His holy name, amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. Okay, guys. Today we're going to review the beginning of the chapter, and then we're going to go through the end of the chapter. And I don't know about you, but I found some of the parts of the end of the chapter rather confusing. And so if you did too, you're not alone. So if you're not there yet, open to page 463. We're going to do a quick review, and then we're going to go through today's stuff, and I'm going to try, God willing, to clear up the confusion, because it is rather confusing. Pollen grain formation and the embryo sac formation and all that stuff is like, what? So it really is hard. I understand that. First, we talked about physiology was actually the day-to-day functions. And so the last chapter we did more anatomy. This chapter we did more of the physiology of the plants. And then we talked about 4 different reasons why plants use water. And so somebody give me one of the 4 reasons plants use water.
Turgor pressure.
Good. Turgor pressure.
Hydrolysis.
Photosynthesis. Transport. Okay, so there we've got 4 reasons why plants absolutely require water to exist. And on the next page, actually on page 464, he introduced the idea of Nastic Movement. And Nastic Movement was no matter which way the stimuli came from, the movement would be the same on the plant because it's a pre-programmed movement. And so he used the example of the mimosa. Whereas, and the mimosa, if you touch it, it closes. Whereas, I know that's such a trip. Whereas, if a plant grows towards a window, then it's growing directionally because of the stimuli. And so that is not Nastic movement. What did we call that when a plant grows towards the light? Good, very good. Phototropism. If we dropped a plant over sideways and the plant started to grow away from gravity, what do we call that? Gravotropism. And then if a plant grows around a stick or something, what did we call that? Thigmotropism. I know that one's a little weirder. Thigmotropism. But those were not Nastic movement because they're actually due to hormones called auxins, and they're growing due to the stimulus, whether it be towards or away from the stimulus. And then turgor pressure. What was turgor pressure? What does that do for a plant?
Keeps it standing up.
Keeps it standing up. That's right. It was cute. In my other biology class, the kid went like this. Well, this. he's talking about the cell wall. Remember I told you guys that it was like a water balloon that made the flimsy box stand up, and so he was doing this. I thought that was cute. So I knew he knew what he was talking about. So the turgor pressure actually is the water going into the central vacuole and causing the plant to have the ability to stand upright. So the plant can do without that and wilt and still come back if you give it water, unless it lives at my house, then it probably dies, but we won't go there. And then hydrolysis, remember hydrolysis, it was actually where it's taking larger molecules and cutting them into smaller molecules that it can use. And then transport is kind of one of the same reasons we need to drink a lot of water, so that our blood is actually made up of mostly water. And in the plants, it doesn't have blood. What do we call the vascular system that goes up in the plant? Xylem. And we call the one that goes down? Phloem. Okay, and that would be the transport means. And remember, in the xylem, we would find water and minerals coming up from the roots. And then in the phloem, we would find sugars and organic material, because that would be what is coming down from the leaves. What did we call the theory that tells us, or the name that we put on the theory that tells us how the water is supposed to move up in the xylem?
Cohesion.
Good, very good. Cohesion tension theory. And that's that idea. Cohesion was that water will hold together even if stress is put on it. And the picture was the water strider there. And so the idea to that cohesion tension theory was this idea that the water is pulled up like a siphon. And if you have to describe it, I would really, and you wanted to be thorough, you might want to mention that because of transpiration in the leaf. Remember, when the stomata, and the transpiration occurs, evaporation occurs from the leaf, that pulls the water up. That's the idea. Is that a fact? Do we know cohesion tension theory is to be true? No, it's a theory, just like it says, so it's our best guess. And then what do we call the process of it going down in the phloem?
Translocation.
Good, translocation. And remember, it's important, which one has to be alive, the xylem or the phloem? Phloem, because it has to actually slow that process down so that the nutrients can be fed to the cells along the way, right? So that was important. And then we also learned that the soil that you put the plant in is very, very important. I personally have learned this the hard way because I've made the mistake of taking dirt out of my yard before and putting it in pots and trying to plant plants in it, and later the plant dies, and when I pull it out, the soil that's in there is like a rock. I mean, it's like a rock. And that's why it's really more logical, if you're going to hope that the plant to live, to buy potting soil, because the potting soil is loam, which has just the right pore spaces for a pot. And remember, the pore spaces were the holes in the soil because of its makeup, so that it let in the right amount of liquid and the right amount of oxygen, etc. And so loam was this idea that it was a mixture of gravel, clay, silt, and sand. I knew there was another one. And then some organic material, and that it would have the right pore spaces for the plant so that it could live. So that's where the potting soil thing comes in handy. And then on 469 through 471, he told us about different types of hormones. And remember, hormones, just like in our cells, our bodies, hormones are directed at specific target cells, and they have to do with growth. So that's what hormones are. And we already talked about phototropism, grabotropism, and thigmotropism. So let's turn over to page 472. And on page 472, we got into a little discussion on insectivorous plants, which are really kind of cool. And do they really eat bugs? No, they don't. Why do they digest bugs with their chemicals?
To get the nutrients?
Good. They need the nutrients. Normally, thank you, normally plants would get it out of the soil, wouldn't they? So insectivorous plants are actually designed to live in soil that is lacking in certain nutrients. And the one I showed you last week was the pitcher plant, which lives in seepage bogs, and seepage bogs have the water running through them all the time, and they're very high acid pH, and therefore they are nutrient poor. So those pitcher plants catch the insects to make up for some of those lacking nutrients. And the same is in this case where the Venus flytrap, I can talk, the Venus flytrap, if you put it in really highly fertilized soil, it won't make these buds that will catch the flies. Have any of you ever had a Venus flytrap? Okay, yeah. Mine didn't live very long. So anyway, I'm really trying with the plants, but
Keep it inside?
yeah.
Well, do you keep a clean house?
Yeah, but there are a certain amount of flies because I live in the country. But they don't, you know, that's true. But if we fertilize it, I don't think we were giving it the right amount of water. I think that's why it died.
Ours died after like a week.
Yours died after a week. I feel better because your mom was probably watering it. Okay, then we got into reproduction, and that's really where we spent our time last week with our lab. Now first, vegetative reproduction was not a new genetic information. That was a situation where you had the same genetic information, because we actually could take a cutting of a plant and stick it in the ground and it would grow a new plant, or you could take a leaf of a plant and you could grow a whole new plant from a leaf. And so this was not any new genetic information. It was asexual reproduction when we talked about vegetative reproduction. And then on page 475, he actually talked about grafting onto an existing tree, and that you could actually make a very good orchard that way. Even if you had some poor quality trees and some good quality trees, you could graft the branches from the good quality trees onto the stalk of the poor quality trees and increase your whole production as far as your orchard. And then we mentioned briefly that that is a picture used in the New Testament of the Gentiles being grafted into Israel. And so it's a picture that we should be familiar with. Then we turn to page 476, please. We got into sexual reproduction, and with Anthophyta particularly, these are flowering plants. So we looked at the parts of the flower. And The online students and most of you didn't benefit from seeing an imperfect flower because all the flowers that I got from the grocery store were perfect flowers. They had both male and female parts, the stamen and the carpel. But back in the back, they had one flower somebody brought in from their yard that I'm digging through the flower and I couldn't find anything but the stamen, and I went, oh my goodness, we have an imperfect flower. Very cool. And so there was one that was brought in. They do exist, is my point. So we did see a composite flower, which, remember, like a daisy or a sunflower, which every little center portion of that flower is actually a separate little flower, which I hope you looked at that. That is just amazing when you think about that. And I don't know about you, but after doing that lab, I will never look at flowers the same way again because they just are amazing. I always thought they were pretty, but they're amazing. I'm going to tell you right now on your test, you need to know the functions as well as being able to identify each of these things. He doesn't tell you on the study guide, but I'm telling you right now, you need to know the functions of each of these parts. So the male part would be the stamen. Remember, it's made up of the filament and the anther. And so that would be for pollination, wouldn't it? Pollen formation, pollination. The carpel is the female part. The stigma actually catches the pollen, and then the pollen, we're talking about this today actually in more detail, the pollen moves down the style to the ovary where the ovule is, and then seed formation occurs there. The sepals were those little leaves that originally covered the bud of the flower when it was first forming. The pedicel is just that stem that attaches it to the rest of the plant. And so you do need to know some of these functions of these parts, and just be familiar with that.
So learn everything in 15.6.
Yes. And it's on your study guide. If you did your study guide already, remember you had that picture, but I'm telling you that on your test you're going to also need to know the functions. Okay? And I don't know why. There were a couple things that I noticed I needed to add to the study guide for this test. So I made sure when we go over it, we'll go over the study guide, and I'll make sure I go over those with you. Okay, so that brings us up to today. Let's turn to page 480, please. On page 480, we start into the reproductive process in anthophytes, and the first part we're going to do is pollen formation, and then we're going to look at embryo sac formation. Now, first he shows you in figure 15.7 that he takes the anther, and he shows you a cross-section of the anther, and he says in the anther there is a one diploid cell, and that one diploid cell is going to turn into a pollen grain. And so we have the one diploid cell, and it goes through mitosis, and it makes 4 haploid cells. And it calls those microspores when it makes the 4 haploid cells. Then it tells us they go through mitosis again, but this time they don't actually divide. It turns into what we would call a pollen grain because it has 2 nuclei minimum. Actually, most of them will go through one more mitosis, this sperm nucleus. Remember, you have the tube nucleus, which I'm going to talk to you about in a second, and the sperm nucleus. And it says in most cases the sperm nucleus will go ahead and mitose again so that you end up with 2 sperm nucleus here. If it doesn't do it initially, and then it's got a hard casing around it, if it doesn't do this initially, it will do it. This mitosis will occur as it's in the process of going down the style before it gets to the ovary and into the ovule. So the pollen grain, once again, he wants you to know that it goes through meiosis to get to here. Oh, did I say it wrong before? I'm sorry. Yes, it goes through meiosis to get to here. And then it goes, thank you for that, fellas. And then it goes through mitosis to get here. So these are haploid microspores. And then these are diploid, these are haploid still, but now it does not completely finish the mitosis process because it doesn't actually divide. I don't know about you, but I found this part confusing because I immediately go, so what's a tube nucleus? And what's a sperm cell in a pollen grain? So let's real quickly just hold your place there and flip over to page 484. And what happens is, and we're going to go back and talk about these things, but what happens is that when this pollination occurs and this gets to the style of the flower, the stigma of the flower, then it's going to go down the style, but then the pollen grain gets to the stigma and it attaches itself. The tube nucleus actually grows a tube. Wow, well that makes sense. At least it's logically named, right? It's a tube nucleus. It grows into a tube. And the reason it has to grow into a tube is it's kind of like a little slide for these other two sperm nuclei to go down, because they will slide down the tube to get to the ovary, to a particular ovule. Okay? So I don't know about you, but when I was reading that, I'm going, what's a tube nucleus? You got to have to read the whole thing before it makes sense. So that's the tube nucleus, as it makes the tube. I think of it kind of like a little water slide or something. And that it's a place for these to actually slide down the style, through the stigma, through the style, to get to the ovule. So far, so good? We'll come back to that. Flip back to where we were on pollen formation. Okay. So when this process occurs, we have one diploid cell turning into 4 haploid pollen grains, but pollen grains have at least 2, if not 3 nuclei, even though they're haploid, don't they? Because of this weirdness that's going on. Okay, well, plants are different. I'm sorry, if somebody that is a heavy-duty botanist and you're thinking, what's weird about this? Well, I'm an animal person. I think in the terms of animals. And so to me, this is like, ooh, that's weird. But if you're a plant person, then you probably think animals are weird. So it's okay. It's all good. We're still trying to give God the glory no matter, aren't we? Because He created all of them. On page 481, we have the embryo sac formation. Now here we have the female part of it. This is going on down there in the ovary and the ovule. And you have one large cell, and I'm not going to draw all of this, okay, because there's too much going on. But we have one, it goes through meiosis, and just like the females in animals, you get one large and 3 small that are polar bodies, and they're going to disappear. But this is meiosis, so it's a haploid situation. But now this large one, which is called the megaspore, this large one will go through mitosis again and again until eventually it ends up with 6 small haploid cells and one large cell with 2 haploid nuclei in it. It's not a diploid nuclei. It's got 2 haploid nuclei in it. Okay, so this is what it'll do, and it'll go through this until we get to that point. When it divides to this in the center of the embryo sac, then we can go through fertilization. Okay, so this will be what this process, and I've cut out steps here. Please be aware of that. Just look at your picture because I'm not going to draw all this. But that's figure 15.8. Now, why does it go through all that? Well, because, go back to that page where we were just at. On page 484. When pollination occurs, and that pollen grain gets on top of the stigma, remember, it's up here, and its tube nucleus makes the tube, and it sends the 2 sperm nuclei down. One of the sperm nuclei will fertilize one of these. Doesn't matter. There's 6 of them there to pick from. One of those is going to get fertilized. The other one fertilizes this one. How do they know which ones to do? But if it's going to work, it has to work this way. So this one gets fertilized, and one of these other ones gets fertilized. I want you to notice when that happens, now we have one diploid cell, and we have one triploid cell. It's got 3 haploid nuclei. And the reason is because this one is going to turn into the baby plant, the embryo. And this one, because of this weird genetic situation, knows to become the endosperm. Okay? We'll come back to that in just a sec. Now let's do the endosperm now. Let's just do it. The endosperm, remember, is the food source for the developing embryo. And on page, you're over there already, on page 485, it shows you that in like corn, the endosperm is even in the finished seed. Whereas in a bean, there is no endosperm anymore. It's because the cotyledon actually either functions to feed the endosperm to the baby plant, like in the corn, or it actually absorbs the endosperm, and the cotyledon itself functions as the food source for the baby plant. Okay? All right. We'll come back to that. And that's why they call it double fertilization, because when this pollination occurs, you actually are fertilizing two different cells with two different sperm nuclei. And that's why if there's only one in here and one tube nucleus, as it's going down the tube, it'll actually divide so that there's two, because it has to do this for the seed to actually form. Otherwise, you get a baby plant with no food source and it's going to die. Because how is the plant eventually going to make food? Photosynthesis. But can it do that in the form of a seed? No, it can't. So that stored food has to be there for it to function. And actually for it to grow into the embryo. Okay? All right. Now let's go back to page 482 and we'll have some fun. I don't know about you, but I was thinking, how are we going to have fun? It's a rough place to end biology, because I think a lot of biology is fun. But actually, God was kind to me, because God knows I like fun, and I found some fun stuff with this, so let's have a little fun with this, all right? I know. How can you make plants fun? Besides eating them, but we won't go there, or giving them this, gifts. But we can have some fun with this. At least I think so, so I hope it's fun for you. That's all I can say. And remember, guys, it's not all about fun. It's all about Jesus, but God made otters, and I'm one of them, so I like fun. I just like fun. All right, so he defines for us pollination, and that's on page 482 if you're not there yet. And pollination is actually when the pollen grain gets to the carpel of the flower, so it gets from the male portion to the female portion, and that would be pollination, just that when it finally gets there. Now, is pollination important to life on planet Earth?
Yeah.
Yes. Without pollination, there would be no flowering plants, and we would all starve. That's really what it gets down to. Flowering plants make up the vast majority of the plants that we eat, and even if you're one of these heavy-duty carnivores, the carnivorous animals, like cows and stuff, depend on these flowering plants to survive. So without pollination, there would not be food on planet Earth. If you're a heavy-duty bread person, guess what? Pollination occurs for wheat to exist. I mean, this is very important to having food. Not about you, but I like food. So that makes pollination important, okay, in my mind. Now, last week I brought you in a hibiscus flower. And the hibiscus flower was kind of the petals. I am not the art teacher, please forgive me. And then it had the very high carpel with the long style and then the stigma up at the top, and it had the little stamen around here. How do you think that that flower is pollinated? Wind, thank you. When you have a flower that all these parts are sticking out like that, it's probably wind pollinated. And that would be the case on that flower. But you guys also last week looked at a carnation and a rose. And if you'll remember correctly, those things were buried in petals, weren't they? Those parts were literally buried in petals. You had to dig through the petals to find the parts, didn't you? How are those pollinated?
Animals.
Okay, good. Animals. Somebody name for me an animal that might be involved in pollination. Bees. That's a real obvious one. Birds. Good. Particularly hummingbirds. Moths. Butterflies.
Beetles.
Beetles. What'd you say? I don't know about frogs. Yeah, but I don't know if they actually carry the pollen. But you know, there's one that your book doesn't mention that I know is a heavy-duty pollinator and very, very important to the ecosystem because of it. Bats. Bats. Fruit bats are very, very important because they actually pollinate on their little hairy bodies. Because remember, bats are kind of like little flying rats or little flying cats, whatever way you want to look at it. And depending. And they actually carry that pollen in their hair, going from one to the other, and they're very important in pollinating. So animals, now I'm going to tell you right now on your test, when he asks you for, 4 different ways plants can be pollinated, don't just put wind and animals because you just cut your throat, okay? You want to say there, wind, beetles, bees, butterflies, moths. Start naming some stuff there, guys. And if you list bats, it's not in the answer key, but it would be a correct answer because it is true. Okay, and you heard it here. Oh, you heard it here. Anyway, so now let's have a little fun with this, though. First off, butterflies like very open flowers because they need a landing pad, don't they? Do you remember reading about that? And the moths are nocturnal, whereas the butterflies tend to be diurnal, being active in the daytime. Moths are nocturnal, so what do they look for, not only as far as a broad flower, but what else do they look for? Light colors, because they want the moonlight to reflect off it so they can see what they're doing. Pretty neat, huh? They are, and most insects, are attracted to the nectar for the smell, because insects have a good sense of smell, whereas birds tend to not have a good sense of smell, which is really good if you're a vulture or a buzzard. But anyway, they tend to not have a good sense of smell. So what do birds look for in what they pollinate? Colors. And he makes the point that most bright red flowers don't have a lot of smell. And I bet you never thought about that before, except for roses, because bees actually pollinate roses. And so most red flowers don't have a lot of smell. And so what pollinates most red or bright pink flowers? Hummingbirds particularly, right? I remember the first time I learned this, I went to a church office and the lady had a hummingbird calendar, and I go, "Can I flip through that, please?" And she goes, "Sure." And I flipped through, and every picture of the hummingbirds for the whole year was either bright pink or bright red flowers. I've had students here, there's a place called Butterfly World, and there's hummingbirds there, and I've had a lot of students that have said to me that they went with a red shirt on. Big mistake. Don't go to Butterfly World with a red shirt on. And the baby hummingbirds were attacking them, okay? And I've read before that baby hummingbirds will attack anything that's red. They'll try to drink from anything that's red, including stop signs. Yeah, including stop signs. They're little bitty. They can't, I don't think they can hurt you. But the point is that they are attracted to red. They say, "Oh, food." And they go for red or bright yellow or bright pink. And so you never want to, unless you want to be attacked by the hummingbirds, you don't want to wear red or bright pink to those kind of places. Yes?
So in general, the more colorful the flower is, the less smelling?
In general, yes. That's a rule of thumb, except for with roses. I like roses. I don't know about you. And that was one of the things I noticed when I did raise roses way back when I had them outside and they lived, was that each of the different color rose had different smells. And I was shocked. I thought roses smell like roses, but that's not the case. Each individual rose color had a different smell, which was very, very interesting. So another creature that depends on the smell, once again it's an insect, is the beetle that John mentioned. And I personally think this is kind of funny that the dung beetle eats dung, which is doo-doo. And so the flowers that it fertilizes smell like doo-doo, that it pollinates, excuse me, smell like doo-doo. Because the beetle, he's looking for doo-doo, so he cruises over to a foul-smelling flower, and he looks for the doo-doo, and in the process he gets the pollen on his legs. And then there's no doo-doo there, so he heads for the next foul-smelling flower, and he looks for the doo-doo, and in the process he's actually pollinating that flower, isn't he? Let's do bees real quickly because they're a lot more fun and it's less stinky. But I bet you've smelled flowers before that you thought, "Boy, does this flower stink?" Haven't you? Well, now you know why. So, because it has to do with what's supposed to pollinate it. With the bees, God designed the bees so that literally they have pollen sacs on their back legs, and when they go to the flower, in the process of them getting the nectar, they're moving in such a way that they get covered in the pollen. Then they'll actually groom themselves to push the pollen down to these areas on their legs called pollen sacs. And then they go to the next flower, and in the process of them getting the nectar, the pollen sac is exactly where it needs to be for the pollen to touch the carpel to pollinate the flower. And as Christians and creationists, we're going, duh, God knew what he was doing. But otherwise, that's like, wow, you know. Now, one of the pollination stories that's an enigma for an evolutionist, orchids are particularly a problem for evolutionists. I just want you to know this. And I talked about this one. This is a lady's slipper, because of the way this is shaped. And it's a type of orchid called a bucket orchid. And I talked about this in my Florida science classes and my middle school classes, and one of the moms saw this and bought it for me. And I was so appreciative because we needed it today, and that's Jehovah Jireh, Lord our provider. He provided this so I could actually show it to you. But this trick is this. God designed orchids to be pollinated in very strange ways. You guys brought an orchid last week, and we were digging for the parts because they were designed to be pollinated weirdly. Anyway, I don't know if that's really a word. The there's a certain type of bee. There's only 2 types of bees, if I remember correctly, that actually will pollinate this. But the bee will come to it because it has a scent, this nectar scent, that actually helps it in its life. It slips down, it's slippery when it tries to get to the nectar, and it slips down into the bucket. There is a gland in this flower that produces liquid that fills the bucket, so the bee's afraid he's going to drown. Okay? The bee's afraid he's going to drown. But he can't get back out the way he came in because it's slippery. There's only one way the bee can get out. There's a tunnel back here. Okay? So the bee has to climb through the tunnel. And in the process of the bee climbing through the tunnel, the flower glues pollen sacs to its back. Then, when the bee gets out and goes to the next flower and does this again, which is amazing because the bee keeps doing this, but the bee goes to the next flower and does this again, there's a hook when it goes through the other tunnel that catches that pollen sac and then glues the next one on as he moves out again. Is that a trip? I mean, orchids are a real good evidence of intelligent design, because how would that just happen without... Oh, and this is the trick. Actually, if you've ever had the privilege of seeing the movies called Incredible Creatures That Defy Evolution, and there's 3 DVDs in the set, and if we have time today, I'm going to show you the last little piece of one. It's about the vanilla orchid. And believe it or not, vanilla comes from an orchid. And this orchid only blooms, you ready for this? 1 day a year. 1 day a year. Now, when the Europeans came to the Americas and tasted vanilla, I'm with them. They liked it. So they took some of these orchids back. And for 300 years, they couldn't get any new orchids. And they couldn't figure out what they were doing wrong. I guess they kept them alive from cuttings. So somebody went back to find out what had happened. And he noticed that there was a little bee, that 1 day a year when it opened, there was a little bee that could climb into that orchid. And it actually, the stamen of that plant has a cap over the anther, and that little bee had to push that off so he could get to that pollen, and then he carried it to the next flower. And with that little bee, for 300 years in Europe, they did not have vanilla flowers because they would not pollinate. Yes?
So that's why they have like the flower on like the ice cream boxes.
Very good. That's good, Josh. I didn't put that together, but yeah. And so there's a lot of examples of these kind of things, but orchids, I think, are the most outstanding. There's another little piece of a video that my Florida science students saw. I don't know if you realize this, but Florida is like the orchid capital of the United States. We have over almost 40 different species of orchids here in South Florida in the Big Cypress Swamp. And I've got a video on it that I showed the Florida science students, and in the video the guy's an evolutionist because he's, you know, a park ranger and he's a heavy-duty evolutionist, and he's telling about the ghost orchid, which is a particularly endangered orchid, and he's out there all night filming the ghost orchid because he's going to show how it's pollinated, and it's only pollinated by one type of moth, and it can only be pollinated by that moth, and I don't remember all the details, but partly because this moth has like a 6-inch tongue. Okay, and it rams this tongue into the flower, and in the process of doing that, it causes the pollen to get on the moth, and then when he goes to the next one, he's pollinating these ghost orchids. But a normal moth can't do this. It's only this one type of moth that does this. And the guy on the video says, it's like winning the lottery. We shouldn't have any of these orchids because the chances of this happening are so slim that it's like winning the lottery. And I really want to go tell the guy about Jesus. Hey, it's not a lottery. Intelligent design. God did this, you know. And so, particularly with orchids, I've seen a lot of that kind of stuff. And remember, in this chapter, we're going to talk about germination. And we'll come back to this same idea. See, what are we seeing here? Plants need insects and birds and bats to survive, don't they? I don't know if you guys got this when we studied evolution, but evolutionists separate these things by millions of years in their development. So if plants developed at a different time than these insects, could they survive? No. They had to be there at exactly the same time, or they wouldn't have been able to continue. So, just so you know.